Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm here today with Kayse Gehret. It's so good to see you.
You too. You too.
I love meeting people out in the psychedelic sphere. You and I met in Vermont at a small psychedelic conference, and here we are. It's the wild path of psychedelics. And you are a global microdose coach, and you have your own podcast. So that's another thing that I'd love to talk about, what it's like for you to have a podcast, what it's like for you to be in this space. And we were talking before about there's the psychedelics and being psychonauts and doing this work. And then there's what is happening in life, how that plays out in life. So welcome here today.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
There's a lot of people out there interested in microdosing. So let's just start there. For anybody out there who's curious about microdosing or who has been microdosing, let's just talk about what you've seen, your experience, and what the benefits are.
Yes, happy to. It's my favorite thing to talk about. We're in such an interesting moment. So when I started back in 2020, no one had really heard of this work, especially microdosing. And so people kind of had to seek it out a little bit, right? It was a certain kind of person who was showing up. Now we're at that point in time where it's in the mainstream. Absolutely. And I think we're on the cusp of it's about to have another big breakthrough in the coming year. And so now it's a different set of people coming. And it's interesting. People used to come with, I'm a blank slate, to now people are doing research on the interwebs and coming with misinformation and things conflicting. And so a lot of my intakes now are re-educating what is actually true in practice versus what people are coming in with reading off Reddit.
Right. So your microdosing program, is it all psilocybin mushrooms? Is it Amanita muscaria as well? What are you coaching people in?
Yeah. So I am all psilocybin all the time, but I do bring in other medicines with other coaches. And so that's the beauty of being in collaboration with many other microdosing guides and coaches around the world is they each have their own expertise and the medicines they work with. And so it's fun as people evolve in their practice. They might start with psilocybin, but then over time they want to call in Amanita, or they might want to work with LSD, or they might want to work with Kana. And so I have those guides beside me to lead those people.
What are some of the stories that you hear when people invite the mushroom or a microdose from some of these medicines into their lives that they're seeing?
Oh my gosh, so many directions we could go in this. So 4 years ago, it was mostly mental health that people were coming for. Now I'm seeing such a variety of reasons and intentions coming in. So spiritual practice, personal development, emotional regulation, couples work, family dynamics and relationships. It's so beautiful and diverse. So what's so fun is people come for one thing. Right. But then they get so much more than they anticipated. So that's been really beautiful to see kind of the more analytical, linear, academic people come who are distinctly non-woo.
Right.
They're like, I'm going to roll with this. But then they have these threads and these openings happen that open them to this whole other world. That's so fun to witness and watch. So I've seen tremendous healing on all fronts. So a lot of physical healing when it comes to nervous system regulation and dysregulation, coming back into balance. I've also seen incredible healing with women's health and hormones around reproductive period dysregulation and cycles, but also so many other things emotionally, spiritually, personally, interrelationally in particular. So many benefits and gifts.
What is happening when we're inviting a intelligence to come into our lives? What do you think is happening in this interrelationship?
Great question. So one of the things we do a lot in the first 6 weeks of my program is really deconditioning from the mindset that this is a pill, it's a medication, and shifting into the mindset this is a sentient being that is far wiser than us, and repositioning the relationship as a relationship, right? So that's really, really tough for some people and it needs reminding and guidance in that. When that happens, though, and people can kind of take their foot off the gas and move into a position of reception and receptivity, then so much can happen, really. And it becomes retuning ourselves to be able to hear the message of the medicine and the spirit.
It's like a deconstruction of self, as mushrooms tend to be the decomposers, and then the connectors with the mycelium web. So it's like connecting us to an intelligence, maybe even beyond the mushroom itself. In the process of microdosing, do you have an experience that you could point to where just the signs were all around you that there was a higher intelligence working?
Oh, gosh. Absolutely. Absolutely. So many, but my experience with mushroom medicine, it's really helped my spiritual practice. It's been unfurling from the beginning. So what began with being a sensitive, intuitive little kid, and I did so much work with intuition medicine and in the healing arts and somatic practice that it kind of thinned the veil over time. But when I started working with mushrooms, it went to a whole new level because I had that assistance, I think, in shedding those denser layers. I have had so many occasions. I mean, one that was really, really incredibly profound. And people often ask me when I share the story, they're like, "Are you sure it was a microdose?" Sure.
Exactly.
Yes. When I first started microdosing, I worked at a very, very tiny, tiny dose and still can work at a very low dose. I don't even think I had microdosed that day in particular, but I was doing a protocol of microdosing at the time. And it was years ago, and we were about to have a fire. Like there was a wildfire in Northern California where I was living. And it was one of those days where the fire had taken off, but the humans weren't aware of it yet. But the animal world was very well aware of it. And I went hiking. It was this really, really hot day where the pressure in the air was really noteworthy. And it was so hot that I didn't have my dog with me, which was very unusual. And I was doing a hiking trail that I had done a million times before. And I had just turned the corner to kind of go up a stretch of a hill. And all of a sudden, I felt nature come alive. I could hear the little insect wings. I could feel and hear like the twitching and the buzzing of all of nature to get your attention, as nature does before spirit appears. It's kind of that cry of nature. That happened, and I turned the corner and I looked up, and there was a bird. It was beyond a bird. I didn't even know what it was. It was so huge that I was like, what is that thing? And I immediately felt, I like re-experiencing now what I felt in that moment, just completely bewildered, humbled, and awed all at once. And I remember I dropped to my knees and I looked up at it, and it opened its wings and shot up. And I'm so grateful it opened its wings when I was there I was able to go home later and see what it was and Google it. And it was a condor. As you probably know, they almost were extinct years ago. It was down to just a handful, I think in the 80s. And people assisted in bringing them back to life, but they were on the brink of extinction and have a very powerful symbolism with the condor and eagle prophecy.
Yes.
And before the bird left, it kind of transmitted 3 messages to me. It waited for me to get them, and then it took off. And it took me weeks and weeks and weeks to kind of peel apart what those messages meant. And I'm happy to share. It gets to be quite a long story.
Before you do, for anybody that is out there that doesn't know the prophecy of the condor, why don't we just kind of put it out into the field?
I'd peripherally heard of the prophecy before, but after that happened, I researched it much more and from different sources and people in the weeks following that. So essentially, the prophecy is that right around this time, the condor would come to fly again with the eagle. So there were two groups of people, the eagle people, which represent what modern Western, this time that we're living in now, a very industrious people, great technological innovation, great industry, great capital, building people. I just think of the 1980s. Like as soon as I hear eagle people, like it's like the 1980s. Doing our personal best, right, at everything.
Right. And 90s, I think. Yeah.
And the Condor people are, I feel, are more the divine feminine. It is the artists, the healers, the caregivers in society that has been so subjugated
And even in all the parts of ourselves, like the side of each of us that has kind of the yin and the yang, right? It's that balancing out of the yin and the yang so that they can fly together. I thought I had also heard, too, that it was that the condor was almost flying with one wing in a way, that it was that the condor was almost flying with one wing in a way, and it was time to balance out with the feminine side, the aspects that are more of the creative, more of the intuitive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's
amazing.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so lots of that prophecy and others all point to this time that we're in right now.
Yeah.
These different
Pretty
cycles
crazy.
of time. So we're kind of at the end of the end and the very beginning of the beginning. And that's why we're seeing such a kind of the backlash, I think, in society is this like hyper eagle.
Right.
We're in
right.
hyper eagle right now before we move into this more balanced place.
Yeah. Beautiful. Oh my gosh. I had an experience, and it was just recently. I was returning from the 7-day retreat that was already kind of like an iboga experience, so deep into a deep aspect of myself that was wonderful to witness. But it was so interesting. When I got home, the house here, the heat was off. So I ended up staying in a hotel in the place that I live. And you don't usually stay in a hotel locally, but my flight had got in at midnight. So I literally booked a hotel, went to the hotel. The next morning I got up and I asked if there was a coffee place close by. There was one a block away. This is where like the things like you can't make it up. So already my heightened senses of like, someone's fork hit the plate. And I was like, oh, it was just like being in this field of like sound and sensation and just subtleties. And when I came out of the restaurant, I walked a total of a square block. I came out of the restaurant the other way. And all of a sudden I'm walking down the street. And so I'm very attuned to the microdose, but also the retreat. And I burped this purgative burp. And this purgative burp is a burp that I really only burped in the process of healing deeper trauma. Like it was one of those like purgative things, and it happens when I'm working with clients. It's like a processing piece. And so all of a sudden I'm going down this street and I burp and I'm like, that's so weird. Why would I burp? And I just instinctively, looked a certain direction, and I was like, wow. And it was down kind of this alleyway. And through there, I saw some things that were so significant in my life. Like I hadn't been on that street since I was like 18. And it was related to a trauma, right? And so I was like, wow. But I had worked kind of to get that charge of that particular trauma out. So I was like waiting for more burps, but only one came. And I walked down the street like I was an explorer. This is the part that like you cannot make up. And I'm like, whoa, yes, wow. And then walk down the street more, whoa. And I'm looking at this building that was significant to this. And half of it, this beautiful building, is rotted out since these years. It's hollowed out. And it's brick. And it's being held up like with post from the street up to its front. So it looks like a facade. It looks like completely something falling down, and it's a facade. And I'm like, this is bizarre. And there's an artist had come and painted with canvas in these beautiful parts of the building, 10-foot by 10-foot paintings of mushrooms. And I was like, you cannot make this up, because it was the mushroom that actually I had forgotten that this experience had happened in my life. So it was the mushroom that brought it to me. And here the building, it's crumbling. And then now it's just a facade. And now it has these beautiful creatures painted on the side. I was like, you cannot make this up. From a wrong turn, and a burp.
That's a literal one. That's beautiful.
So wild.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting because I was with some scientists recently asking about what is the science on microdosing, right? What is it showing us? One of them recently, I interviewed the psychedelic scientist who I really, really like. And he said, the science shows that it's really no more than placebo. And so it's interesting to know that that's what the science is showing. And yet, in my own experience, and then client after client, kind of shockingly will say the stories or the things that either came up or the ways their life shifted. So maybe it's not quite measurable.
That's it. It's interesting. I reflect on this very rarely these days. I think 4 or 5 years ago, that was very important to people in my community and programs, is like science proving nature. And things are happening faster for people too. I've noticed, especially in the last year.
Oh my gosh, yes.
The healing has happened so quickly and remarkably that
I'm
it's
seeing
not a
the
question.
same thing. It's like time jumping.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people in my community, like if we pose this question to them now, they would say, well, science is just behind nature.
Right.
if people
and
want to
it
wait
makes sense when you really think about it. We're waiting for science to catch up to what, indigenous people, our ancestors and wisdom teachers and elders and all of us now know already.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Went to one of my groups one night. I was falling asleep and my spirit guide came to me, as she does, and she showed me this visual of this long pathway. It was so gorgeous, ornate, and just books and books and books, shelves of books and books and books. And and I was like, wow, is that the Akashic Records?
Right.
And she smirked. She was like, no, that's every book that's been ever written by every human. And look how little you all know. It's like, ouch. But she was doing that in reflection on that particular group call. It was our first call. And I had a lot of very intellectual people in this group who were kind of pushing knowledge around, pushing resources around, pushing information and science around. But that's, as you know, not really getting into the body of the work and the soul knowing. Of the work. Yeah.
The soul's knowing. Yes. So when we were at dinner that night, we all got talking about mushrooms. And here we are with about 6 or 7 psychonauts, I would call them. And I'm actually just admitting that myself. I'll say to friends, like, I need to interview some psychonauts. They're like, you're a psychonaut. And I'm like, no. And they're like, what? Like, are you kidding?
You're a psychonaut.
Yeah. They're like, how many medicines have you done? And I'm like, yeah, I guess I'm a psychonaut. Anyway, we were with psychonauts and we asked the question of what is your favorite medicine?
I think we just asked, like, what's everybody's favorite psychedelic to work with?
Yes, exactly. And what did we find out?
that I was the only one that appreciated mushrooms most. Yes.
Yes.
And everybody else, it was striking. It was mushrooms kind of ranked last for a lot of the people there, which was intriguing. And so, yeah, it was so fascinating to me. And upon probing, like, why this strong reaction to it, they were like, because mushrooms are really big honesty. and hard. Sometimes.
Like, unmitigated, I would say. Like, if I had to say what medicine helped me the most, is probably a combination, but certainly mushrooms have been huge as far as helping me. Yeah, I would say that most of us felt mushrooms had helped us almost the most, but they were the ones we were most a little afraid to go into on the larger doses.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so fascinating. And I think that's why I appreciate them so much. Each of us have our own spirit,
Mhm.
right, that
Mhm.
matches with a different resonance of a different medicine. So that's a question I love getting. And when people are brand new, they're like, well, how do I know what medicine is right for me? And I'll say,
Right.
you know, it'll call you.
Right.
And if you don't listen, it'll
Exactly.
keep calling you. And it's beautiful. And so the more I've gotten to know mushroom spirit and my guide, they're
Mhm.
very similar that way. She's very direct.
Fascinating.
Yes, and so the way she communicates is very similar to the mushroom too.
What would you suggest? So someone, again, wanting to start a practice with microdosing, what are some of the key elements that you really want people to be aware of before they even engage in the process? Because I've had people come and I'm like, does your life have space for this right now? Because life can change. What are some of the things that you want people to be prepared for in microdosing?
Thank you for that question. I think fundamentally mindset is a big piece of it. You know,
Hmm.
as more and more people are aware of this and it's more mainstream, really separating it from a pharmaceutical experience from the start,
Hmm.
I think is really, really important in the process. And so knowing that this is going to change you.
Hmm. Yep.
That is the work, that is the journey. And so it's not something that's just going to take away your migraines. It's going to
Right.
change all of you, all the facets
Hmm.
of your life,
Hmm.
personally, professionally, spiritually, all the things. And so, really assessing if people are aware of that, first of
Right.
all. And as you said, in a place in their lives where they have the flexibility to grow and change and are supported. So I always ask people, how well resourced are you as an individual, but
Hmm.
also how well resourced are you in terms of your support structure that surrounds you at this point in your life?
Yeah, really important. I think too, also, what is the capacity for you at this point in your life to feel? Because I'm just remembering another little microdosing story where I was with a friend and we microdosed and we were painting. I'm taking this intuitive creativity class, and suddenly I said to her, do you have any charcoal? She was like, charcoal for your painting? I'm like, yes, I need ashes. I need ashes on this painting. And I had no idea why. Like, I literally had no idea. It was all just kind of happening and coming. And then my conscious mind was catching up. Next thing I know, I am drawing with charcoal a house and stick figures. My house burnt down as a little girl. And so this painting just transformed into this processing of what I felt that I didn't know. But it was interesting. It started with she was playing some music, and I said, oh, this is making me sad. Can you turn it off? Again, the mushroom was getting into something, and she said, are you sure you want me to? Or do you want to stick with it? And I was like, oh, okay, keep the music. And then the ashes. And actually, the day went on from there with some of the most profound happenings. But I came home and was like, wow, I wasn't prepared to feel such sadness and grief today. And but it actually led me also to reach out to a friend that I had disconnected with for a while and say, like, hey, like it was so transformative. And I don't think science could chart that,
No. No.
but be ready to feel.
Yeah. I think too beautiful. And I was just speaking about this with a client yet literally yesterday about how two things you just shared. One, it takes people back how fast it can happen.
Hmm.
Like spirit moves so much faster than our mental minds do.
Right.
So sometimes people like this healing can happen in a feeling or in a
Right.
dream. And we're not used to that. We're so conditioned to heal through our mind of and doing things and thinking things that people are like, oh, it takes them a while to catch up to the speed with which that can happen. And then another question I get often from people going, well, who is this not for? Who is microdosing not for? Who
Hmm.
quits? Who fails?
Right.
Right?
Fails. I love it. There's that mindset, right? Who
Right?
fails at
Who
microdosing?
fails? And honestly, the honest answer is people who don't have the capacity to feel the
Yeah.
full spectrum that you are going to be summoned to feel. And so most people, that far and away people who are coming to practice are ready for that. They're called because their spirit's like, game on, it's time for you now. But other people who have a lot of fear and a lot of resistance to that, sometimes they can start to crack open, especially if it's somebody who's been a long time repressor. Like people,
Right.
cigarette smokers, absolutely. Cigarette smokers start microdosing, typically grief comes forth
Wow.
in
Interesting.
waves that is really, really pins them to the edge of, because, putting smoke into your lungs,
Right.
we've been suppressing that grief, and our lungs
Right.
are the organ that hold our grief. So having people be made aware, like you said, the level of resourcing, how much they have been able to sit with discomfort and
Yeah.
grief in particular.
Right. And I would have to say, as a follow up for that, whether it's psychedelics that you're kind of using as a tool for awakening or changing your life, or whether it's meditation, even coming off of the meditation retreat, and the teacher that I work with, he has always said, like, if I have a moment where it's like, something's coming up that's a collective thing or an individual thing, you have this capacity to feel this. But I think we are taught in our culture to keep suppressing, to keep going, to keep smiling, to keep, just performing, right? And I have been myself quite surprised at, as psychedelics peel back even the ability to hold at bay any truth, anything that is unmetabolized, any emotion unmetabolized. I have been actually really surprised to the level of, number one, how hard, but number two, the capacity that we all do have as human beings to feel. And then also, on the other side of that, what it opens up. Like, it's hard to express once something has been moved, how life then opens up. Your podcast. Let's just go
Yeah.
there for a second.
Yeah.
What's it like for you to have a podcast about psychedelics?
It's been such an unexpected joy. It's so fun. So let me tell you, it started, its origin
Well, first,
story.
it's Microdose for Healing. It's Microdose for
Microdosing
Healing
for Healing
podcast.
podcast. Yep,
Okay.
it just matches our platform.
Right.
And it came about because in spring of 2023, I got a call from the TED Talk folks. So TEDx Talks, and they were doing an event, and they asked if I would do a talk on microdosing. And I was like, immediately, hell yes. And also, oh my God, terrifying. I need to go find a public speaking coach, like right now. And so I went through this whole little whirl and got all excited for the opportunity to speak to a large audience about this work that I love so much. And a couple days later, they called back and said, so sorry, we still want you to come. We want you to help promote it with us, for us, but you can't speak. And I said, why? And the organizer has a really great sense of humor, fortunately. Right. And I said, so what's the problem? And he said, well, there's a problem with it's being hosted at an academic institution, and the TED people are wary of having someone who doesn't have any scientific credentials or academic credentials. And the fact that you're doing this work versus talking about this work is problematic. And I kind of teased him, and I said, you guys have been doing this to women since time immemorial. Right? We want you to help. We want the stories, but we don't, you can't be on stage. You need to be.
That Western mindset of the structures that we've built to actually validate people's knowledge.
Yep, exactly.
That we use to validate knowledge. Yeah.
Yep. So I immediately was like, okay, well, how can I use this moment to be of service?
Exactly.
And so I said, well, I can't speak. I'm going to ask you hire my friend, colleague, female colleague, to put the event together, because I know she will choose great people that do have the credentials necessary. So that happened, which was fun. And then I also decided to launch my podcast in that moment so that I could give opportunity to give voice and feature and platform people who would not be able to talk on stages
Right.
for those
Yes.
same reasons.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
intentionally feature a lot of underground guides,
Yes.
people who don't have the ego drive to be a speaker.
Right.
Right?
Right.
They're totally unaware of that world. So that was the original motivation, and it ended up being beautiful lemonade.
Wow. Okay, speaking of science a little bit, for the science-minded person out there, psilocybin comes from the mushroom we know. And what is happening in the brain that we actually do know scientifically?
So we do know scientifically how psilocin plays on the brain and the serotonin receptors in the body. A lot of the attention so far has been given to the receptors in our brain, but we actually have serotonin receptors all throughout our body, particularly in our gut. So that is something that has not been talked
Not
about
at
or
all.
researched a
No.
lot, but I think we're going to find in the coming months and years how that's why food is medicine. And
Right.
without going down that rabbit hole, I think there's going to be a whole synergy between microdosing and nutrition therapies, and eating a living foods diet again,
Right.
because of the effect it has on our serotonin receptors in the lining of our guts. So at the conference that we were at together, I loved Robin Carhart's Harris presentation on this, because his way of explaining how it worked, he used the term canalistic thinking, which I thought was one of the best representations to me that I've heard from a scientist
Explain
framing.
it. Yes.
So it's kind of like when someone comes to practice, they're coming most of the time to create change, right? And whether that's mental health, a lot of it are issues, physical, mental, otherwise, are due to our rigid, formatted thinking minds, right? So if you think of the canals of our minds,
Exactly.
we just go down the same canal over and over again. And so the way psilocybin works on the brain and the receptors is it opens this up to new pathways. So you have these new little branches and shoots coming off the main canals.
Seen them? I recently saw them under a microscope. I was like, wow, it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you can see this happen with people. And so I often, when people are just getting started in practice, the reason why it's so important to have a community, a guide, a coach, lifestyle practices, and support is if you do microdosing and you just stay in those canals, it's not going to do anything. And people are like, it's not doing anything because it's not going to do anything, right? You have to contribute and be in relationship to it to go the different direction. One of my favorite anecdotal stories, I was teaching microdosing with Psychedelics Today. In their facilitator training program, I teach the microdosing portion of their training. And one of the students said that he was experimenting giving microdoses to his dog. I was like, awesome. And he said he noticed with consistency, his dog always, when he wasn't microdosing or didn't microdose him, he always wanted to go the same pathway through the neighborhood in the same way every time. And when he gave him a microdose, he wanted to go in a different direction intuitively.
So fascinating.
Right? And I was like, that's it. That's exactly
That's fascinating.
How it works.
Even when I just said the story about, I could have walked back to the hotel on the same street. I have no idea why I turned.
Yeah.
Just as a simple thing. But yes. So I think the other thing, when people have said to me, well, the science says it's placebo. And I'll say that is true. And also what the science says is psilocybin is an incredible anti-inflammatory in the brain and in the body. And we do know it does build new neuroplasticity. Those two things alone, if you didn't see any other change in your life, psychologically, behaviorally, those two alone radically support your life. And then you get the benefit of the things that we can't really, as I said, calculate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think of all the medicine, particularly mushrooms, and it's hard because science requires standardization
Right.
and consistency in measurement. And mushrooms in particular, as we know, it's so unique. It's so attuned to each and every spirit. I mean, you can have the same dose, the same strain, and still it will be a completely different experience,
Right.
depending
Right.
on so many other factors that science can't measure or
Right.
predict. So
I even particularly like that Amanita muscaria will not be captured. Like, you cannot grow it. Sorry. Like, it will not grow in a basement in your little grow kit. So that's kind of fascinating too. What do you think about how important set and setting is, even to microdosing or having journeys? I know part of our conversation that day in Vermont was about sacred sites and the energy of the land. And I do remember when I first came into medicine space, luckily I had somebody who was very well attuned in indigenous wisdom. And I remember her kind of taking tobacco and going outside and asking the land whether it was okay that we did the journey that day. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, that's very woo-woo, you know? And then as time has gone by, I think, again, not knowing how, but the wisdom of these medicines start to shift your perspective to a greater truth. So I'm curious for you, your thoughts on where we do medicine and sacred sites, and even being on a sacred site, what that's like.
I love this question. Yeah, I think looking back early in my life, young in my life, I noticed when I traveled, I felt very different in different places energetically. And that's when I knew there were certain like vortexes and spiritual imprinting or past life connections to different places on the planet. Then when I started our programs very, very early on in our groups, I saw how often people would start microdosing and they would be drawn to move. And it would happen so often where people would go in the 6 weeks, they would say, I'm drawn to be somewhere else. I'm drawn to be somewhere else. And a year later, there they were. They had done it. And I was like, there's something to this. And I think from witnessing the conclusion I have come to is as you release with mushroom practice a lot of your density and your conditioning, and you come to a pure, clean, coherent energy, you're far more sensitive to place and energy. Yeah. And I think all of us have a different resonance where we have our ancestry or our roots, sometimes that transcend ethnicity and religion. Like I totally believe, we have different roots and different ancestries. We've all been different genders and ethnicities over time. And so that kind of comes back online for people when they connect with mushrooms, and they're like, suddenly I'm drawn to go to this country and I've never had an interest in going there. And then when they get there, they find they were similar to your story that you shared today. It's like they have this experience that's so deeply healing. It's a moment, but it's the healing power of it was decades in the making, or connecting the dots that they had long connected, or they were supposed to be there to meet a specific person in that moment. So I think there's so much to the connection between our spirits, our energy, and the land.
Yeah, totally. It's hard to describe, but for anybody out there listening, and I'll have you back and we'll tell a bunch more stories, because I think sometimes it's the story that's like, yep, okay, this is what the science is saying. But sometimes the story is so remarkable about, you're just reminding me that I ended up, I don't even know if I saw you at this point, going on a trip to a pyramid, and you just mentioned you're headed to Egypt. Like, I somehow ended up, I don't want to say the place because there was, the law was broken.
Enough said.
Because we actually went into the pyramid underground and returned some artifacts that had been taken out of the pyramid by archaeologists. And this wasn't the plan. Like a week before, I didn't even know the name of that city. I didn't even know that there were major pyramids in that city. And I had no idea I was going to be going in the dark of night, dressed in black, to bring ancient pottery back into this beautiful underground. And it's interesting going back to your story of the Condor. Above ground is this masculine pyramid that had, even human sacrifice at the time. This is an old, old, old pyramid. And underground, there was some hidden tunnel that had very feminine energies and represented actually the woman in the structure and in the drawings. And so these are the things that, like, you take a mushroom and suddenly you're in a pyramid, bringing back pottery in a place you didn't even know, on a site that you're like somehow meant to be. Like, what? It's kind of crazy.
And that's not even a journey. That's real life.
That's real life. That's like your life just goes whoop. And you talked about the vortex, right? These vortex of energy in these places. It's almost like you get pulled to them. There's some kind of energetic field. So any offerings for anybody out there listening for your coaching or inviting them into a group or a way to get in contact with you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I love working with beginners. I love it. So it makes me so happy to introduce people to this practice. So I have a complimentary 80-minute workshop on my website that's free for anybody to access. And I try to answer all the frequently asked questions that you would ask kind of in an intake session with a guide and a coach. So anybody is welcome to access that. For people who have had a microdosing experience and want to share it, that's also, the mushrooms love this. That's what they do. So a lot of times people unexpectedly start this practice, and then a year later they're doing this work and they're like, how in the world did that happen? But it happens all the time. I mean, I had so many people in my programs who came to practice, had never practiced before. They were comedians, or they were beekeepers, or they were corporate managers, and now they're death doulas and they're psilocybin guides, or they lead microdosing communities. And it can happen if it's meant to happen. The mycelium takes over. So I also have a free 5-hour all video training to teach people the basics of how to share this practice professionally. If you are a breathwork practitioner or a yoga teacher who wants to start incorporating microdosing into your other healing offerings. So that's also available too for free.
Thank you for the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you. And likewise.
Yeah, I'd like to have you back and do a 2-part series and talk about kind of what you've learned from guests, and even being in the psychedelic space, using these tools, and then actually in conversation, what shows up and who shows up in your life, and some of the things that you've learned through this process.
I would love to. One of the gifts of kind of this pandemic era, post-pandemic era, is it forced us, like it or not, onto the interwebs, like here online, right? And I had been in the healing arts for, almost 30 years now, and had always done in person, one-on-one, group classes, touch therapies. And so it really, that weird time kind of brought us all online. And one of the things I've loved so much about the way we've had to work, it is truly mycelial. Like we can connect with each other across time and space and latitudes. And it's really been a beautiful light side of a shadow of time in our lives to be able to connect so deeply across time and space.